I'm still waiting for the camera to come on. So we had three breakout questions on the table. The first of which being, what is the contemporary analysis for the text? So who would like to discuss what they talked about in their breakout groups as it pertains to the contemporary analysis?
I can mention something.
Yeah, go for it.
So, we talked about how still in today's world, like blacks are still being targeted and painted in this really bad picture. They're painted as monsters, as savages as they were in the readings. Um, but what they always fail to mention is that um, there's reasoning behind this, and it's justified in most ways. For example, as it pertains to the readings, um, they talk about environmental issues and this idea of inhabitable locations where they were living and forced to migrate to because of imperialism and because they were being targeted. And um, I think Gabriel had mentioned that, you know, they're painted as these monsters, and really nothing has changed from now to like today, because in today, you still see in media or on the internet, blacks being targeted and painted in this bad picture. I know I'm repeating myself, but um, what I'm trying to get at is it's like this being painted in this picture, it's enough to drive kind of anyone mad. It doesn't even matter who's like up on that podium. It's yeah, that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. Kind of to relate it to a film I had seen. It was like Joker. I know it's fictional, but it's this idea that you got so much going on in your life, and society has these norms going on, or you keep being targeted, and at the end of the day, you're seen as the bad guy, but it's like it's enough to drive anyone mad. If you keep being pushed to those limits, anyone will turn.
Yeah, it's interesting, Roberto. That's actually the comment that I made in the class before you all, right? How can somebody endure all of these things and keep even their sanity is a miraculous feat, right? And then to be painted and vilified for being angry when you have a right to be justifiably angry is even more maddening. Anyone else? What was your contemporary analysis of the reading? Uh, Go ahead.
I said that they looked at nature as more so like their bread and butter, in a sense that their situations led them to where they were, Africa. And I don't know, the, instead of like having their faith relied on the people who they were taught to praise or the people who they were taught to believe in, they put their faith in nature. And I feel like that's really powerful on its own because it shows the significance of the agriculture in Africa because it's like pushed more so of by faith. Like these people live their lives solely on the basis of nature, and obviously there were bad things, but that's nature as of so. Uh, I don't know if this is like piecing together as like it is in my head, but like I'm more so saying like their faith in nature really like solidified what you know they believed in. If that makes sense.
It does, but I think also, right, is I don't think it's like a just kind of contextualize and clarify in my estimation, and please tell me if I'm wrong. But I don't think it was like a blind faith in like nature, right? Like, oh, these crops are just going to grow because I believe it. So, like, there was work that was put in to make sure
Yeah.
that these crops grew, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, and to me, that's also a level of science, right? Like, there's great thought, effort, and energy that goes making sure that as you put it, your bread and butter is maintained and intact, right? So I think I hear what you're saying, but I just want to kind of articulate the fact that it's not happenstance. Like work and agency and planning went into that process.
Yeah, and I think more so I'm like I'm basing it off of the fact that in the reading they talked about so many different kingdoms, and like I feel like they felt that not they had this connotation that Africa was like the lesser, continent, lesser place to grow, agriculture. So I'm mostly talking about like they had faith to, I don't know, push themselves to show that this is what we can do. This is what I can make out of what I'm given. And I'm going to make this my seat at the table for these other kingdoms, as like mentioned. Like I seen them mention Arab. I seen them mention a few other like African kingdoms, but I more so took it in the fact of like this was their seat at the table, if that makes sense. After all of like the negative connotations surrounding Africa.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, I got you. I think I got you. I think we're on the same page. And I'll try to crystallize some of these things in my discussion. Danny, I seen you like come off of mute. Were you gonna say something? Danny, were you gonna say something? I seen you come off of mute. If not, it's cool.
Yeah, I was gonna like kind of say what Azai said because like we're in the same group.
Okay. So you ditto for you, bet. So going into question two, and talking about the role of nature, but also the role of religion, right? How did they add to the destruction of African civilization?
I can answer that. Um, I say that Christianity was the destruction of the African culture, the diaspora, um, because they had this deity of this white European man and said that this is your God. This is who you're supposed to worship. They shoved this religion basically down the Africans' throats. They didn't give them a chance to choose whether or not if this is what they wanted. Um, and because of this forced teaching, it caused a lot of Africans to forget their history. It made them forget their religion, their who they are as a person. And well, yeah, that's all I got.
Thank you, Michelle. Gianna?
I wanted to add more to the religion aspect. Um, I feel like the spread of Islam and Christianity like really brought things down because um, like the kings of whoever was ruling specific kingdoms were convinced that Christianity or Islam would help them with trade and boosting their own economy. So obviously, if the king is Christian, then their people are also going to be Christian. So there's this weird dynamic of um like she was saying, like not really knowing who you are, like losing that sense of knowing yourself and like your own like customs kind of slowly disappearing because you have to conform to other customs that you're not really familiar with.
It's a good call out. And I thank you also for incorporating Islam in there, because I think often what happens is we just focus on like Christianity, and Chancellor William does a great job of saying like, before we just like pin this solely on Christianity, right? Like the Muslims and the Arabs also have played a role in our destruction, and Islam played a role in our destruction. Absolutely. Shai? Shai, is your hand up?
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, sorry. Um, kind of to piggyback on what Michelle said with Christianity, I know we can't exactly focus solely on Christianity, but speaking from a Black Christian stance, Christianity is kind of just what I've known my whole life, and knowing this new information of how, well, it's not new, but like it's kind of refreshed in my mind, to see how the beginning of the Europeans kind of shoving down this this white man superiority, kind of like Michelle was saying.
Yeah,
It's really become a staple in a lot of Black households in general, even years and years and years upon years, kind of just idolizing this white man and what he tells you what you're supposed to do in this book that white people wrote, instead of really remembering or really becoming connected to what Black people wrote, what they had going on back then, instead of really going by the white man's words, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, good call out. Thank you. What about nature? How did nature shape the destruction of Black civilization? Very clear about the whole section of the role that nature plays in forcing not only migration but destruction. Filberto?
Yeah, I think I remember reading that maybe like 3/4 of Africa at that time was just inhabitable. Like there was just one like big parts, or like very small parts of Africa that were, that had the riches or had the nature that one needs to even survive. And the problem with that was, even if they migrated to that, the European imperialists or the Arabs or whatever imperialists at that time, they took advantage of that little soil, that little habitable space that they had. So while they were forced to migrate and therefore lose, um, the unity amongst each other, they would lose like their language amongst another. There were so many new languages brought up because of the fact that there was so much separation and migration. Trying to just um, get away from like those tough environmental. I think Gabriel mentioned. I think it was in the readings about like alligators, or just like tough ecosystems. And yeah, I mean the one part, like, or the one soil that they had, they were still stripped away from. So it's like, how are they supposed to as a civilization, like, come together or even survive?
Yeah, good call out for bro. Thank you. Michelle, and then we'll go. I think Shy has her hand back up. I'm not sure. But go ahead, Michelle.
Um, yeah, and picking back off of what Filiberto, I believe is what um, it does apply today too. There are some African tribes that were these are ancient African tribes that are going extinct today because of climate change, because the earth is heating up. Um, a lot of some of the African lands are becoming uninhabitable for humans, and so we're losing a lot of the native tribes that been here since before civilization.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Oftentimes, especially having these conversations within the United States, when we think about this in contemporary times, excuse me, we think about like in terms of like gentrification, right? Like this forced migration. But I do like the way that you're relating this back to Africa even today, right? And how the climate is still, because of Western interests, we have climate change, which is still forcing African peoples off of their land. Perfect. What stood out to you all about the reading? Was there anything that stood out to you about the reading? So I knew all of this already. There's nothing new. This is all secondary information for you. I appreciate you, Filberto. Let's kind of spread this out a little bit. Someone who you have not heard from, what stood out to you in the reading? Gabriel?
I don't know if this sounds kind of silly or not, but I remember I was telling my group that I didn't really understand how most Black people had like kind of like Muslim backgrounds, or like kind of like Arabic names. So I think learning from this reading that I didn't really understand how the Arabs played a part in this like enslaving Black people and African people as a whole. And I thought that was interesting because like I knew the Asians had a part in it because obviously the Silk Road was a big part of it, but I just thought that was it that made sense.
And I think unfortunately, from a contemporary standpoint, those two communities, even more so than Europeans, still play a very negative impact in Africa. When you talk about African human trafficking, a large percentage of that is going through the Middle East. Spaces like Dubai and the United Arab Emirates and things of that nature. There's a very large sex and human trafficking ring that goes on through these Middle Eastern areas. And also now, very much so, Asian countries are in Africa extracting resources and producing the same forms of brutality that we read about within the text, right? I came from Ghana 2 years ago, and amongst the sea of African people and the sea of Black faces, the sprinkles that you did see were Asian. And I read several articles about them still engaging in the practice of marrying into Ghanaian, in this case, Ghanaian royalty, so they would have access to Ghanaian land and Ghanaian resources. So again, these two communities that are not largely talked about as it pertains to the destruction of Black civilization are still effectively being able to play the role in the continued destruction of Black civilization. Michelle, did you have your hand up?
Oh, no, you said it. In Congo, the Asian countries are extracting rare precious minerals, and they're using children and elders as slaves.
So, especially when you talk about the Congo, all of you on this Zoom right now or on the Zoom on some kind of electronic device, iPad, iPhone, computer, all of those devices are ran by what's called cobalt. And this is a mineral that comes strictly out of the Congo. So when Michelle is talking about child labor, adult labor, these labors are going into producing the mineral that makes our electronics work. We would not have these devices if it were not for the Congo. And so when you think about Africa being a poor continent, just imagine if all of the financial wealth that cobalt produces goes into African hands. Think about the wealth of Apple being produced into the Congo. How wealthy would the Congo be? And I'm just talking about one corporation, right? Apple, just one corporation. I'm not talking about Samsung and the likes, right? Because they all use the same mineral.
And
So,
not to interrupt, but to add on to, and because of their manufacturing these precious minerals, they're poisoning the water. So not only are not only the Congolese forced to do labor, but they're also forced to do labor while being poisoned.
yep. And this has been going on for centuries, especially when you talk about the Congo, because that gets you back to the work of King Leopold II and his extraction of rubber, right? And the Belgian Congo was the original name, right? If you know about Belgium, another thing that they're very famous for is chocolates, right? Now, give you some fucked up history, but it's true. There was a time where you would see folks in the Congo missing arms and hands. This was done when King Leopold would find people not working at the capacity that he felt necessary, he would chop off their arms and hands. That became one of the most popular chocolates in Belgium, were little black hands. Did y'all catch that? So I'm not saying that they sold the hands that they chopped off, but the sickness and the sadistic nature of them making these hands into chocolate and importing them across Europe for folks to eat.
That's fucking gross. And I've heard about that too. And when I heard about it, I was like, that's fucking sick.
Yeah, this is what we're dealing with. Okay. Anyone else who wants to speak to something that stood out to them? If not, we'll get into the my notes on the reading.
Something that stood out to me was that like that Africa like appeared to be like the perfect place for Asia and Europe to like come to because of like how like divided like everyone was, and like they weren't like not like a community like, but like they weren't as united as they could be. Like in the reading it described them as like disunity or something like that.
Yeah. And you know, Danny, to your point, man, like, and I think you said this on Monday, and I'm not, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you said,
Yeah.
you know, look at all of the social media discourse that we have, and it's trash. And what I'm attentive to in your statement is how disunifying the conversations are on social media. Black men against Black women. Black folks from America versus Black folks from Africa, right? Every outlet that we hear is creating divisions. Every outlet that we hear is creating divisions. So the dependency of our disunity allows for these systems of destruction to maintain themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Because like if we can't come together as like one community, then it's easier to like take us down in like smaller numbers.
Absolutely. And that has been working for ages. Anybody heard of foundational Black Americans? No? All right, well, fuck, I won't get into that because I don't want to give them no space because they don't deserve it. But I was gonna go at they next if you knew about them, but since you don't, we'll say that for another day.
Wait, what did you say?
What were they called again?
Foundational Black Americans, Tariq Nasheed, FBA.
Don't tell me they're one of them conservatives, left, right wings, bullshit people.
No, they believe that it's tied to reparations, right? And they're arguing that the only people who deserve reparations are folks who are born, Black folks who are born in the United States. Their parents are born in the United States, and they're able to trust their bloodline to, I think, so your grandparents would have to be born in the United States to be considered a foundational Black American. But part of their discourse, part of their conversations are ideas around Black folks outside of America being parasites, being those who provide a negative stereotypes and negative outlooks on Black people. They espouse a lot of the conversations that you hear from the right around migration, but how they focus on migrations are focusing on African and Caribbean migrants and saying that they are the pariah in American society, in particular Black American society. This is done as a ploy to try to secure reparations for Black Americans.
That
Right?
sounds like Antifa to me, a black Antifa to me.
Kind of, it's kind of.
That's what it sounds like.
But more importantly, it's just about, to me, divisiveness, right? Because we can't, even from a standpoint of reparations, where did the people get kidnapped from to be put into enslavement?
Right.
Africa.
Right.
So, but again, I
And
don't
Caribbeans,
We'll
don't Caribbeans, don't they deserve reparations too because their ancestors were enslaved and brought to those islands? That don't make no sense.
That's how we got here. But again, the point of that is not to be logistical or to make sense, but to create divisions. So now when you look on Twitter, you see people from Africa and Africans from the United States going at each other.
Right. Yeah.
But let's get into the text. We got a little bit of time. What you read was from the book, The Destruction of Black Civilization. It's what's called a seminal text, right? Like a core foundational text in the Africana studies canon. If you want to engage any notions of history, this is typically one that's always pointed to. So this is why I felt it was crucial that we engage this text. Now, I want to start with page 44 towards the bottom of the page. It was pointed out that the study of Blacks must begin in Egypt, because most of their indestructible monuments are there. And further, because many of the artifacts archaeologists have been uncovering during the past 75 years as Egyptians are in fact African. Yet, the very heartland of the race and the cradle of civilization were actually further south below the First Cataract, centered around the capital cities of Napata and Monroe. From there, Black civilization spread north, reaching its most spectacular achievements in what became known as Egyptian civilization. So I want to take this right here and kind of draw us back to the first reading that we had. But I want to draw us back to the first reading by working through a statement that I made on Monday, right? You have to be able to cross-reference. You have to be able to take two various books and see if the information lines up. Now, think about the first reading, the teachings of Ptahhotep, and what they say about the Metu Neter, right? The hieroglyphics. There was no evidence of a developmental stage in the production of the hieroglyphics. They come on the scene fully actualized, fully put together, right? So think about this. If you're looking for for research on the hieroglyphics, where would you look? What location would you look in? Where are the hieroglyphics located?
Egypt.
Egypt, right? Okay, thank you. So what he's telling you, so now let's go to today's text. It's pointed out that if you're going to study Black civilization, you must begin in Egypt, right? Because that's where the monuments are. That's where the indestructible monuments and artifacts are, right? But in fact, the heartland of the race, the beginning of the civilization, the cradle of civilization starts lower south, right? This is the origins of the Kemetic civilization. They start in Monroe and Napata and then move their way north, right? So these areas of Monroe and Napata, they predate Kemetic civilization. So think about this, stay with me. So if you're looking in Egypt for the developmental period of the Metu Neter, you won't find it there because we now know, based off of this reading, that civilization didn't start there. They started further south in Monroe and Napata, right? Now, one could argue or one could imagine you may find evidence of a developmental period for the Metu Neter in Monroe and Napata. Does that make sense? So this is what I mean when you start to begin to cross-reference text. So in all reality, you could go ahead and write a book about the possibilities of the Metu Neter starting in Napata and Monroe, right? Like these are the type of intellectual problems that you can produce as a scholar. But you have to be able to make connections between what you're reading. Does this make sense to you? All right. So as he moves, he kind of talks about what forced migration, right? And before I get into the passage, I want you all to think about Monday's reading, right? In Monday's reading, they make these arguments about the stereotypes and myths that encapsulate African people into negative stereotypes and myths, right? One of those stereotypes and myths is the notion that African people are primitive, right? Now, one of the ways that they signify this primitive notion is the fact that African people lived in huts. You ever heard this? In fact, if you see images of Africa even today, they won't show you the glorious cities of Nairobi, Kenya. They won't show you the glorious cities of Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. They won't show you the glorious cities of Accra, Ghana, right? And I'm gonna be real with you. If you were to look at these cities that I just named off, and like in comparison to what you see in LA, they shitting on LA. You don't have these homeless problems in Africa like you do in LA. I've been to Africa. I could tell you, I saw no homelessness. But that is not what you'll be depicted. Go ahead, Michelle.
I was gonna say, weren't they the first architects to build castles?
Absolutely.
And then they taught Europeans?
Absolutely. Unarguably, this is the case. In fact, when the Europeans got to Africa, they destroyed the castles because of how magnificent they were. But again, so think about this stereotype and think about how the notion of a hut signifies primitiveness or inferiority, right? I'm gonna read the bottom paragraph on page 45. So this is to provide the context for what I'm about to read. We have Arabic invasion that's trying to produce enslavement. We have European invasion that's trying to produce enslavement, right? And the Africans are fleeing from these enslavement forces. Whenever they splintered off, refugee groups found a place where the soil seemed favorable for cultivation and the land unoccupied by preceding migrants. They settled and began to build villages again. A sense of relative security was necessary the sense of relative security was a necessary factor in deciding where to begin a new settlement. A crucial question was how many miles had they put between the slave hunters and themselves? For the kind of house and community buildings they would erect depended directly on the probability of permanent settlement or sudden flight again. In short, they could build large, sturdy, and attractive compound homes and temples of worship or easily demolished huts. So let me help further contemplate and I'll try to contextualize this. So in this class, there's 20 of us, right? And let's just say, for sake of argument, we are being hunted by enslavers. It probably won't be the best idea that we all 20 run together, right? It may be more prudent to say, you two go this way, 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 right? So they spread off. So as you spread out, your object is to create distance between those who are hunting you and yourself, right? So once you feel like you established enough distance, right? And you found a soil, because remember, as you all noted, only 1/4 of Africa had inhabitable soil, right? So you create enough distance, you found some soil that you kind of create crops in. So then now you're going to settle up. But then the question becomes like, yo, are you sure we made enough distance between these motherfuckers? Because if we build this big ass house and we got to run again, that house ain't going to help us. What we may want to do is build a little hut. So that way, if these motherfuckers come, we can break down a hut real quick, we up out of here, right? This is the practicality of what their decision-making went into. Shows how intelligent they were, right? But what Europe was effectively able to do was come in and say, oh, this is how they live? They're savages. They're primitive, right? But historical contextualization becomes important because once you understand they live this way because they're on the run, it all makes sense. Does this make sense? So you always have to deal with the historical contextual analysis. Allow history to provide the context for how you view things. Because it's easy to say, oh yeah, they're primitive, they live in huts, without knowing that they only live in huts when they needed to. They had just the same capacity to build castles, temples, and churches. So he talks about this fragmentation and isolation and then the consequences of the fragmentation and isolation. So remember, I gave you the examples there's 20 of us and we're broken up into groups and we separate, right? The 20 of us speak a common language. We all speak one language. But what happens is because we have to split up, you get different dialects, you get different interpretations of the language. So correct me if I'm wrong. Somebody from New Orleans speaks vastly different from someone in California, correct? Do you want better? Especially from a Black vernacular standpoint. Someone from Oakland, California speaks vastly different from someone from Los Angeles, California, right? So you understand the notions of dialects and things of this nature. Spanish, right? How many different versions and iterations of Spanish is it depending on where you're from, right? How Spanish is speaking in El Salvador might be vastly different from how Spanish is speaking in Mexico. But it's one language. So you get this, right? So as you migrate, the language begins to kind of change and evolve. And it splinters into these various different languages. So he says fragmentation and isolation had two monumentous consequences. First was that the isolation of various groups led to the development of over 2,000 different dialects and languages. So one, it produces over 2,000 languages and dialects. Second, the second fateful outcome was the rise of all of these tongues widen the gulf between Blacks that territorial distance had already achieved. So what that is saying. So remember, we already spread out across land, right? Y'all go north, we go west, y'all go east, we go south, right? So that distance that we're putting it between each other, he's saying that's one of the consequences of this migration, right? Distance has been put between us. Now you add that on top of the language barrier, it creates further division, right? Now we have a cultural division in the form of language. Now we have a spatial division in the form of like territory, where you're at, right? So this is what he says leads to the further fragmentation and isolation. These are consequences, excuse me, of the fragmentation and isolation. Yeah, I don't want to go into that. 'Cause, 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 Definitely. I think this is an important fact. I'm looking at 47, middle of the page. It says modern Africans and students of Africa have tended to emphasize the destructive impact of European imperialism in Africa, while ignoring the most damaging developments from the Arab impact before the general European takeover in the last quarter of the 19th century, a relatively recent period. This point is important for one of the most remarkable chapters in history of the Blacks is that dealing with those dauntless leaders and people who, having lost some after another, with 3/4 of their kinsmen, nevertheless overrode all the forces of destruction and death to build again, right? So what I kind of pull from this, right? One, we focus on the role Europeans have in our destruction, but we neglect the role Arabs have, right? And again, as I mentioned in the beginning of class, the largest human trafficking in Africa and enslavement in Africa is in these areas, right? But he's talking about how we endured these things, right? Like he's saying, like, yo, this process damn near took 3/4 of their population, but they still endure, right? In fact, there's a very profound statement on page 53. Nature was a problem. Forced migration was a problem. Foreign invasion was a problem, right? Enslavement was a problem. Religious forces was a problem, right? All of these things became vast problems for African people, but in spite of these things, African people maintained themselves. And to me, that's profoundly important. And it produces this question on page 53. How then were the Blacks able to battle invading enemies from one end of the continent to the other for several thousand years? True, they were overcome in the end, but what sustained them through all those centuries of struggle on so many different fronts and against so many different kinds of enemies? Weakened so generally by both disease and what became perpetual hunger, whence came their strength and courage to carry on? It may well be that the answer lies in the death-defying pyramids they built in Egypt when the land was theirs. So for me, where Chancellor Williams is pointing us to what allows African people to sustain themselves through all of these atrocities, through the horrendous ma'afa, right? Is spirit. And I pointed to you all in the first week on how these pyramids were built with supreme mastery of the stars. And I explained to you how in these universities, right, how you moved up the university ranks was mastering spiritual concepts. So if he's telling you that the way that they're able to survive these things is through the pyramids, the science that built the pyramids, I'm telling you the science that built the pyramids was their spirituality and their desire for knowledge. I want to leave a little bit of the time that we have left for Fishbowl. You have to do it twice per semester. You have one time to pass. You could talk about my lecture. You could talk about your journal. You could talk about what was discussed in your breakout groups. Who would like to volunteer? And if not, I'll just call that random. I already have Andrew, Noelle, one more. And Danny, perfect. All right, we'll go in that order. Andrew, go ahead and set us off.
So I feel like what you said when you said they had to go, like they had to separate because of hunters. I feel like that's what created migration, because that means that they created a little bit of groups, which means that they had to go against larger enemies, and that's what created them to be like weak. So especially since they had weapon power and the others had like only bow and arrows, I feel like that's what caused the migration, and they kept on like having to go to different homes and things like that.
Good call out. Good call out. Thank you. Nolani?
Yeah, so right now you're talking about like fragmentation and how in the reading it stated like how that first started out as like, well, fragmentation basically happened because it was done for security reasons, like to keep people safe. And then from there you got the different languages and people started separating. And then you had other like things that contributed to that hardship within society, which were like having to escape from being captured, the lack of resources. But I also think that this led to like a deeper type of fragmentation, because like on page 55, it says, when the sale of their fellows became the chief source of wealth, African leaders became increasingly estranged from the finest thing in African life, the sense of community and kinship with all who would be friends. And I connected this to like the reading that we had last week, because that talked about like the principle of Ma'at and like the teachings of having like uplifting moral values that really denounced greed and like uplifted being humble and family oriented, and like how all of these situations just ultimately affected African society in a negative way, because they had to really let go of some of these principles, and that created like maybe more chaotic circumstances for them. But even in that, they were able to like overcome those obstacles.
Yeah, good call. And I like how you're tying the readings together from the previous weeks and seeing how it's brushing against your understanding of what you're reading. That's beautiful. Danny?
So in my breakout room, we were like talking about how like kind of how the odds were like against Africans in a way. Like the Africans, they have like as far as like their crops and like their resources went, like they had things that Europeans wanted, which kind of like put them like as like a target on their back as out of like jealousy and other things, and how like religions were also weaponized against Africans. And then also like how they had to spread out like for their survival. So it wasn't like that they were just like disunted disunified like because they wanted to, but like they kind of had to for their survival. But like even then, that kind of still made them an easy target.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, Danny, I don't see you, but you be talking some real shit when you be talking, man. So I know you. I appreciate that. You're absolutely right, right? Like, you again, that reminds me of what I was saying earlier in the sense of the social and historical context becomes important. Like when you understand these forces, what you call like these push and pull forces, our situation makes sense. And again, to like to provide like a sandwich to what Roberto starts off with, when you think about all of this shit, you think about all of this shit, and this is historical, right? We're not even talking about once we get to the Americas. Put that in totality, it's a fucking miracle that African people aren't stark raving mad. Stark raving mad. And in fact, I would argue that it would be justified that we are angry and violent people based off of what we've been through. Do you understand the science of what's called epigenetics? Epigenetics is the science that trauma gets passed down in your DNA. And so the trauma that I've gone through as an individual, because I carry my children with me, right, as a man, that trauma is being impressed upon them. For women, the trauma that you experience as an individual, because you hold the seed on you, that trauma is being impressed upon them. So they're saying this trauma gets encoded into your gene pool and it gets passed down from generations to generations to generations to generations. This book says from 4,500 BC. How many generations can be traced back from 4,500 BC to 2024? All those generations of trauma getting passed down with no real space for healing, no one really to listen to what you've gone through. What they offer you is prison. It's a miracle that we're not stark raving mad and we're not as violent as they make us out to be. Gianna?
I had a question from what you were saying about generational trauma. Is there a way to break that kind of cycle, or is it just impossible to do that?
That's why there's such a big conversation in Black communities and Black families around breaking generational curses. It's our attempts to try to rid ourselves from the drama that we've endured. For me, so I'll put it to you this way, and it talks about it in the book, right? But I'll frame it to you in this sense. The vestiges, a vestige is a lasting effect. The vestiges of enslavement, there's three: your name, your language, and your religion. I'll focus on the first, your name. Moore, Willis, what else we got? Michelle, what's your last name?
Small.
Small. So at least for Willis, Moore, and Small, Moore was the man who owned your family's the plantation that your family worked on. Small was the man who owned the plantation that your family worked on. Willis was the name of the man who owned the plantation that your family worked on. My last name by birth is Davies, Davies. That is the last name of the man who owned the plantation that my family worked on. I've been doing this research and this Africana studies thing for over 20 years. In this process, I've seen this name Davies come up several times. Captain of the slave ship. One of the utmost trafficker in African people. If you notice that Davies ain't my last name. I would be damned if I had my son and my daughter carry on the name of our enslaver. For a good portion of my life, I played football, and how football works, they don't call you by your first name, they call you by your last name. Every time you do something good, your last name is called on the loudspeaker. So every time that I was celebrated, whose name was being championed was my oppressor. So my attempts to break that curse is to change my name. So you have your name, your religion. I'm not a Christian, I'm not a Muslim. I practice African spirituality. What we were doing as people before they came onto our continent and started taking over. I haven't got the language part down yet, I'm working on it. But for me, these are the ways that I go about detaching myself from horrific experiences of our past. Does that answer your question? Very good question. Philberto, you had a question to close us out or a statement?
Yeah, it was really based off of your statement. I think it was beautiful and disgusting. It was this idea of no time of healing, you know, like as blacks. It's beautiful because you have no time to heal, and yet like civilization as a whole is still resilient and still continues on, right? There's beauty in that, and it's because of that, like that spirit that you talk about, right? That soul, that ka, right? But it's also disgusting because there's no time of healing. Like even in today's world, we see the reflection from like now to the readings, this idea of being painted as a savage or as monsters, right? And so you've been given no time to heal or even a chance of like peace. And to kind of go into what Gianna's saying is like, well, how am I supposed to get away from these curses, or how am I supposed to get away from these paths when I'm not even given a chance to heal? So I don't know. It's tough. It's frustrating, really, just hearing.
Yeah. And so part of what I do also is create this as a space for healing. To talk about these things in a way that affirms you as Black people offers a space for healing. This is why we meditate before we do whatever we do. This is a spiritual project. I'm trying to heal the intellectual harm that's been done to you while you were in these schools for 12 years. I'm trying to course correct that body chemistry that you've had to accumulate by sitting in those classrooms for all this time. So this is my humble offering to kind of course correct the damage that you've been experiencing through your K through 12 educational or schooling experience. But we ran out of time for today. We will pick back up on Monday. Please come prepared to discuss on Monday. If you have any questions for me, don't hesitate to reach out. I hope you all have a great
Bye, Professor.